In the spring of 1884, in the high country above the town of Larkspur in the Colorado Territory, there lived a man who had stopped speaking more than a sentence at a time. His name was Caleb Orr, and for 2 years he had kept his words the way a careful man keeps his last matches, spending them only when there was no other way to start the fire. The neighbors said grief had made him simple. They were wrong, and the woman who would prove them wrong had not yet stepped off the wagon road, though she was already on her way, carrying a single trunk and a letter she had not been able to throw out. What the people of Larkspur expected was a widower who would sell his 80 acres before the next hard winter and drift down to the railroad towns to be forgotten. What arrived instead was something none of them had the imagination to predict. This is the story of a man who buried his heart in the ground beside his wife, and a stranger who knocked on his door one evening and asked, with no apology, for a place to stand out of the wind. Stay with it, because the door he had nailed shut against the whole world was about to be opened by the one person who did not knock the way the others knocked. Caleb had come west in 1876 with a wife named Ruth and a wagon that carried more hope than tools. They took up land along a creek the Utes had once called the Silver Thread, a narrow run of cold water that fed a meadow 40 acres wide before the slope climbed into lodgepole pine and granite. Ruth had been the planner. She kept the seed in labeled tins and the accounts in a ledger with a green cloth cover, and she had a way of standing in a doorway with her hands on her hips that made a hard place look temporary. They built the cabin together, 2 rooms and a loft, with a stone chimney Caleb laid by hand over the course of one autumn. For 6 years it held. Then, in the winter of 1882, a fever came down the valley, and it took Ruth in 9 days, and it took the unborn child she carried with her, and it left Caleb with a ledger he could not bear to open and a cabin that had become too large by exactly one person. He buried her on the hillside above the meadow under a granite marker he cut himself, and he carved her name in a single line beneath it, and after that he did not speak much at all. The work did not stop, because the work never stops on a homestead, and that was the only mercy of it. He had 30 head of cattle and a milk cow named Dolly, who had been Ruth's particular friend, and a black gelding called Tom, who had carried him through the worst of it. He cut hay in July with a scythe, whose handle Ruth had wrapped in leather to spare his blisters, and he stacked it in August into ricks he topped against the rain. He mended the fence where the elk broke through in the fall, 3 rails at the bottom of the meadow that went down every autumn like clockwork. He split wood until the pile reached the eaves, and then he split more, because the splitting kept his hands busy, and his hands were the only part of him he still trusted. He ate standing up at the bench by the window because the table was for 2, and he could not make himself sit at it. He let the lamp burn down early, because the long evenings were the hardest hours and sleep was the only door out of them. The town saw him at the feed store once a month, paying in coin, saying thank you and little else. They had stopped inviting him to things. A man who answers an invitation with silence is eventually not invited, and Caleb understood this and did not blame them. The storekeeper, a decent man named Pratt, took to setting Caleb's flour and coffee on the counter the moment he came through the door, so that the whole transaction could be done with a nod. And Caleb was grateful to him for it in a way he never found the words to say. He had simply decided in the quiet way that the deepest decisions are made, that he had loved once, and that was enough, and that the rest of his life would be a matter of keeping the place in order until it no longer needed keeping. Grief, he had found, was not the storm everyone warned you about. It was the long, flat country on the far side of the storm, where nothing happened and nothing changed and the days were all one color. What he did not know that spring was that down in the town of Larkspur, a woman named Hazel Pruitt had just buried her own husband and was discovering, the way the newly widowed always discover, exactly how little the law and the town intended to leave her. Her husband, a freighter named Asa, had died when a wagon brake failed on the grade above Bishop's Cut, and he had died owing money to 3 men who came to the funeral mostly to be seen counting. Hazel was 29 years old. She had no children, no family west of the Mississippi, and a rented room she could keep for 11 more days. She had a good back, 2 strong hands, and a stubbornness that her late mother had called a sin, and her late husband had called the best thing about her. She also had a letter, folded soft from handling, that Asa had received 6 months before he died and never answered. It was from a man named Caleb Orr, a man Asa had freighted goods for twice, and it asked, in the plainest terms, whether Asa knew of any honest hand who might want winter work and a roof in exchange for labor on a place up the Silver Thread. Hazel had read that letter 11 times in 11 days. She knew it was not addressed to her. She knew that a respectable widow did not ride alone up a mountain road to knock on the door of a man she had never met. She knew what the women at the boarding house would say, and she knew the particular pity in the voice of the landlady who reminded her, each morning, how many of the 11 days were left. She knew all of it, and on the 12th day she packed her trunk anyway, because the alternative was the kind of slow disappearance the railroad towns specialized in, the laundry work and the boarding house kitchen and the gradual sale of everything that had a name attached to it. And she had decided she would rather be turned away from a real door than vanish behind a polite one. She had grown up the daughter of a Kansas wheelwright who taught her to use his tools because he had no sons, and she had married Asa at 20 for reasons that had seemed like love, and turned out to be mostly the wish to be somewhere else. And she had spent 9 years learning that a freighter's wife is alone 3 weeks of every 4, and she had filled that aloneness with work, with a garden and a cow, and the mending she took in, until she could do nearly everything and depend on nearly no one. That was the wound she carried up the mountain, not grief exactly, for Asa had not been a cruel man, only an absent and an easy one, but the slow erosion of a woman who had learned that the people who were supposed to hold the line did not hold it, and that if anything was to stand, she would have to stand it herself. She paid a teamster $2 to carry her and the trunk as far as the fork where the wagon road gave out, and she walked the last 2 miles with the trunk roped to her back like a peddler, stopping twice to shift the weight and once to catch her breath where the road bent hard around a granite shoulder and the whole valley opened below her, and she came up the meadow in the long gold light of evening with her auburn hair pulled loose by the climb, and her skirt heavy with trail dust, and she saw the cabin and the smoke from the chimney, and a man at the woodpile who had stopped his axe to watch her come. He did not wave. She did not stop. The whole of what happened next began with a woman who would not be waved off, and a man who had forgotten there was anyone left who might come. She set the trunk down at the edge of the dooryard and straightened her back and looked at him across 30 feet of trampled grass. Caleb had not had a stranger walk onto his land in 14 months, and the last one had been a surveyor. He set the axe head down on the block. He was aware of how he must look, 2 years unbarbered at the jaw, sleeves rolled, a man who had clearly been alone long enough to stop noticing he was alone. Hazel spoke first, because she had walked too far to lose her nerve at the finish. She said her name was Hazel Pruitt, widow of Asa Pruitt the freighter, and that she had come about the winter work he had written to her husband about, and that she knew the letter had asked for a man, and that she did not much care because she could do anything a man could do on a place and several things a man could not, and that she would work the season for a roof and her board, and would not ask for wages until he was satisfied she had earned them. It was the longest speech anyone had made to Caleb Orr in 2 years. He stood with the low sun on the side of his face and considered her the way he considered weather, and then he said the second sentence he had spoken aloud that day. He said the barn loft was dry and she could sleep there tonight and they would see about the rest in the morning. He had meant it as a way to put off a refusal. It turned out to be the door, swung open before he understood his hand was on it. That first night Hazel slept in the hay above Dolly and Tom and the smell of cattle, and she lay awake a long time listening to the unfamiliar sighs of the mountain quiet, and she thought she had made a fool's bargain, and could not for her life think of a better one. In the morning, she was up before him. When Caleb came out at first light to milk, he found Dolly already milked, the pail covered with a clean cloth, the cow's stall forked out, and the woman splitting the rounds he had left too big the night before, setting each piece with a short, clean stroke that told him she had handled an axe before and had not been lying about her hands. He stood in the cabin doorway and watched her work and felt something he had no name for and did not want, a small, irritating warmth, like the first ache of feeling returning to a hand that has been out in the cold too long. He told her she had split them short. She said he had cut them long. Neither of them was wrong. It was the first of 1,000 small exchanges in which each of them was a little right, and it set the shape of the thing to come, two stubborn people in a hard, small world, each refusing to be what the other had braced for. The work of that spring and summer made its own argument, slowly, the way the best arguments are made. Hazel did not ask Caleb to talk, and Caleb did not ask Hazel to leave, and in the space between those two refusals a homestead began, against all of his intentions, to run like a place with two people in it again. She found Ruth's seed tins in the lean-to where Caleb had not been able to look, a dozen of them in a row with the names inked on strips of paper pasted to the lids, and she did not make a ceremony of it. She simply planted what was still good, the beans and the squash and the hardy turnips, in the kitchen plot that had gone to weed, working the soil with the wheelwright's hand fork she had carried west, and she said nothing about whose hand had labeled the tins. Caleb saw the rows come up straight and even and understood what she had done and why she had said nothing, and he carried a bucket of creek water to those rows every evening for a week without being asked, which was his way of saying a thing he could not say. She mended the chicken run where a fox had been getting in, and the eggs that had been 3 a day became 8. He reset the gate that had sagged for a year, and oiled the hinge and hung it so it swung true and latched on the first try, and she noticed and said so, and he said nothing and was pleased. She scrubbed 2 years of neglect out of the cabin floor on her knees with lye soap and a brush worn to the wood, and she found, under the bench by the window, a ledger with a green cloth cover, and she set it on the table without opening it, and went on with her scrubbing, and that night Caleb saw it there, and his throat closed, and he left it where it lay, and in the morning it was still there, and on the 3rd morning he opened it himself and read his dead wife's small careful hand recording the price of nails in 1879, and the weight of the autumn calves, and a line, near the back, that simply said the chimney drew well at last and he did not break, and afterward he understood that the woman in his barn had known he needed to open it alone and had left him the room to do it. He never thanked her. She never expected it. That was the country they were learning to live in together. By midsummer he had begun, without deciding to sit at the table. The first evening he did it, lowering himself onto the bench across from her as though the chair might give way under the weight of 2 years. Hazel set his plate in front of him and said nothing at all, and went on eating, and let the sighs of the moment pass unremarked, which was the kindest thing she could have done and which he understood as such. They ate in silence most nights. It was not the old silence. It was a silence with someone in it. There was a boy who came into it that summer, and he mattered more than his size. His name was Ned, 8 years old, the youngest of the Hartley family who ranched the next section down the creek, and he had taken to wandering up the Silver Thread to fish the deep pool below Caleb's meadow, because his own father was a hard man with a hard hand, and the pool was far enough from home to be safe. Caleb had tolerated the boy the way he tolerated the weather, but Ned was not a child who could be kept at arm's length. He asked why the calves were branded and whether it hurt them and where the creek started and whether a man could ride all the way to the ocean if he had a good enough horse. And he asked these things of Caleb specifically, who answered in single words at first, and then by some erosion he did not notice happening in whole sentences. Hazel fed the boy because he was thin in the way that told its own story about the Hartley table, and she taught him to gut a trout without wasting it, and she let him talk, which his own house did not, and by July he was eating supper at the cabin 2 evenings a week, and calling Hazel by her first name, and asking Caleb the kind of questions that have no good short answer. It was Ned who said the thing that neither adult would say. One evening in August, sitting on the creek bank with a willow pole while Hazel and Caleb worked in easy silence to stack the cut hay, the smell of it green and sweet in the warm air, the boy looked up and said, with the flat certainty of childhood, that it was good Mr. Orr was not lonesome anymore. Caleb stopped with a forkful of hay halfway to the rick. He did not answer. Hazel did not answer. But neither of them corrected him, and the not correcting hung in the warm air between them like the smell of the cut grass. And Caleb set the hay on the stack and did not look at Hazel, and Hazel did not look at Caleb, and the boy, satisfied, went back to his fishing, having said the truest thing that had been said on that land in 2 years. I will step out of the story for just a breath, the way the teller of a long tale sometimes does, to ask you something, because the country this story lives in is one many of us know. Have you ever watched 2 people who were certain they were finished with the world slowly, quietly, almost against their own will, begin again? If you have, you will know what was happening on that mountain, and you will know it could not be hurried, and you will want, as I did, to see it through to the end. So let me carry you back to the meadow where the hay was stacked and the first cold nights were coming, and where Hazel was about to tell Caleb the thing she had not told anyone. She told him on a night in September, when the aspens had begun to turn and the air had the iron smell of coming frost. They were on the porch he had rebuilt, and she had her late husband's letter in her apron pocket, and she took it out and put it in his hands and told him to read it. Caleb read his own words to a dead man, and Hazel told him the truth she had carried up the mountain on her back, that Asa had never answered the letter because Asa had been a man who let the easy thing rot rather than do the hard thing, and that she had read it because she had nothing else, and that she had come knowing it was not addressed to her and had let him believe at first that her husband had sent her, and that this had been a lie of omission, and she was tired of carrying it. She said she would understand if he wanted her to go down the mountain in the morning. Caleb sat with the letter in his hands a long time. Then he told her his own thing, the thing the town thought it knew, but did not. He told her about Ruth, and the fever, and the child that was never born, and the ledger, and the marker on the hill. He told her he had decided he was done, and then he said, in the plainest voice she had ever heard from him, that he had been wrong about that, and that he had known he was wrong since the morning she split the wood short. They did not touch. They did not need to. The frost came down on the meadow that night, and neither of them felt the cold. The country does not let a thaw go uncharged. Autumn that year turned hard early, and the talk down in Larkspur turned hard with it. A man named Royce Vidal, who held the paper on a good deal of land in the valley and wanted more, had heard that the Orr place had a widow living on it, and no marriage to make it decent. And Vidal was the sort of man who could make a moral question out of anything that stood between him and 40 acres of bottomland with year-round water. He came up the Silver Thread on a fine bay horse one October afternoon and sat in Caleb's dooryard without dismounting and made his offer, which was an insult dressed as a kindness. He would buy the place at a fair price, he said, and spare Caleb the shame the whole valley was already speaking of, and spare the widow the winter that was certainly going to break a place this high with only 2 hands to run it. Caleb listened to all of it. Then he said the longest single thing the town would ever hear he had said, which was that the place was not for sale, that Mrs. Pruitt was a hired hand and her business was her own, and that Vidal could carry his concern for the valley's morals back down the mountain before dark. Vidal smiled the way men like Vidal smile, and said the winter would do his arguing for him, and rode off. He was not wrong that the winter would argue. He was wrong about whose side it would take. What the season did first was take the hay. A Chinook wind came through in late November, warm and wrong, the kind of wind the old hands distrusted on sight, and it melted the early snow into the haystacks, and then the temperature dropped behind it and froze the wet hay into ice, and a third of the winter feed was ruined in a single bad week. The cut grass rotted black and sour at the heart of the ricks. Caleb walked the ruined stacks with his hand pressed to the spoiled hay and did the arithmetic out loud, which was a thing he did now that there was someone to do it to. 30 head and a milk cow and 2 horses, he said, and feed for maybe 20 through to spring, and no money to buy more after Vidal's kind of winter had run the price up, and no neighbor close enough or fond enough to spare it. Hazel did the same arithmetic and came to the same wall. And then she did the thing the valley would not have done, the thing that would matter most in the end. She remembered a name. Asa had spoken of a man up the creek, a Ute named Sapa, with whom he had traded twice and dealt fairly, and of whom he had said the only respectful words Hazel ever heard him give another man, that Sapa's word was better than most white men's bonds, and his horses better than any of them. She rode Tom 4 miles up the creek to the cluster of cabins where Sapa's family had wintered for years, people the town crossed the street to avoid and spoke of in the ugly shorthand of the time, a man named Sapa and his wife and his 2 grown sons. Hazel had no claim on them but that second-hand respect and her own straight dealing, and she knew it, and she did not pretend otherwise. She sat her horse at the edge of their ground until she was asked in, and she stated her business plainly as one trader to another. She offered Caleb's good summer pasture along the creek for their horses through the following season, and the labor of her own 2 hands now, in exchange for hay enough to carry the herd to spring, and she named a fair count of it and did not haggle down. Sapa, who had watched the valley's contempt for 30 years and measured people by what they did rather than what they said, looked a long time at the woman who had ridden alone up his creek in the cold without a man to speak for her, and he looked at the straightness of her offer, and he said he had hay, and that the bargain was fair, and that he and his sons would help her haul it before the next snow closed the road. They came 2 days later with 3 sledges and worked alongside Caleb and Hazel from dark to dark, and the men spoke little and worked well, and when it was done, Caleb shook Sapa's hand and held it a moment longer than the work required, which Sapa understood. The valley did not see any of this happen. The valley would only see the result in the spring and would never understand it. The crucible came in January, on the coldest night of a cold winter, and it came the way the worst things come, all at once and at the worst possible hour. Dolly the milk cow, Ruth's cow, who was old now and should not have been bred but had been, came into a hard labor at dusk with the thermometer on the porch post reading 31 below and falling. A cow that calves in that cold can lose the calf and then herself within the hour if the calf comes wrong, and this calf came wrong, a breech, 2 small hind feet showing and the rest of it lodged, and Dolly down on her side in the freezing straw of the barn and groaning in a way that meant she was failing. Caleb stripped off his coat and his shirt in the cold because a man cannot do that work in sleeves, and he knelt behind the cow in the lantern light with his bare arms slick to the shoulder, and he worked to turn the calf the way a thing that does not want to be turned must be turned, slowly, by feel, in the dark inside while the cold closed on his bare back like a hand. Hazel held the lantern and held Dolly's head and talked to the old cow in a low, steady voice. And when Caleb's hands began to fail in the cold, she put her own bare arms in beside his and they worked together, 4 hands where 2 could not manage, breathing on each other's fingers between efforts, losing the feeling in their feet, losing the feeling in their hands, and not stopping. They worked for 2 hours. The lantern guttered low, and Hazel filled it without letting go of the cow. At the end of it, near midnight, the calf came, hind feet first into the lantern light, and it lay still in the straw, and they both thought it was dead. And Hazel cleared its mouth with her frozen fingers and rubbed it with sacking the way you rub a thing back across a line it has nearly crossed. And the calf shuddered and drew a breath and bawled, one thin sound in the enormous cold, and Dolly lifted her head and answered it. Caleb sat back against the stall in the freezing dark, his bare arms shaking, and looked at the woman kneeling in the bloody straw with a living calf in her lap. And something in him that had been buried on a hillside for 2 years came up out of the ground for good. He did not make a speech about it. That was not the country they lived in. He found her coat and put it over her shoulders, and he carried the calf to the warm corner by the cow, and when they were both standing in the dark barn with their breath smoking and the calf nursing and the worst of the cold beginning, slowly to lose its grip on the night, he took her 2 frozen hands in his 2 frozen hands and held them against his chest until the feeling came back into them, breath by breath, the way he had warmed his own 100 winters. He said one thing. He asked her to stay. Not for the season, not for the work. He asked her to stay the way a man asks for the one thing he has decided he cannot live without, plainly, with no ornament, a single sentence in the cold. Hazel, who had walked up a mountain rather than disappear, who had buried a husband and read a dead man's letter and lied by silence and confessed it, who had put her bare arms into the cold beside his, said the plainest word she knew. She said yes. They did not touch beyond the holding of hands. They did not need to. The calf nursed, the cow breathed. The cold went on outside, defeated in the one small place that mattered. The circuit preacher, a tired kind man named Reverend Stoll, who rode a 4-county loop and married and buried half the territory, came up the silver thread in the first week of March, when the snow was rotting in the meadow and the creek had begun to talk again under the ice. He married Caleb Orr and Hazel Pruitt in the dooryard of the cabin Caleb and Ruth had built, with the boy Ned standing up beside them in a clean shirt his mother had pressed, and with Sapa and his wife and his sons there at Hazel's particular invitation, standing where the valley would not have let them stand, and with Dolly and the January calf and the black horse Tom looking on over the corral rail. There was no fine dress and no cake to speak of, a wedding the size of the life it began. Hazel wore Ruth's seed-green shawl, which she had asked Caleb about first, and which he had given her with his eyes wet and his voice steady, because he had understood that honoring the first did not betray the second, that a heart is not a single small room but a house that can be added on to, and that Ruth, who had made hard places look temporary, would have liked the woman who would not be waved off. Ned told everyone afterward that the post Mr. Orr set for the new gate that spring was set deeper than the old one, and that this was how you could tell. The valley came around the way valleys do, slowly, and without ever quite admitting it had been wrong. Royce Vidal sold his paper and moved on to a county with softer mountains and easier morals, and the men who had counted Asa's debts at the funeral found other funerals to count at. And the talk about the widow on the Orr place curdled, and then, when the place not only survived the winter but came through it with 31 head where there had been 30, quietly died. In the spring, Sapa's horses grazed Caleb's good summer pasture as the bargain had promised, and the 2 families traded labor and meat and the kind of plain respect the valley had no use for, and when a dry summer 3 years later threatened to break half the homesteads on the creek, it was Caleb and Hazel and the Utes the town crossed the street to avoid who knew where the high water still ran, and who showed the valley, without a word of reproach, how to find it. The people who had said Caleb Orr would sell before winter, and the people who had said a place that high could not be run by 2 hands, lived to drink from creeks those same 2 hands had cleared. And if they ever connected the one thing to the other, they kept it to themselves, and that was all right. Hazel never said she had told them so. She did not need to. The water said it for her. They ranched the Silver Thread for 41 years. Caleb's voice came back to him in pieces over those years, never quite to what it had been before the fever, but enough. And Hazel said in her old age that she had married the quietest man in the territory, and then talked enough for the both of them and called it the best trade she ever made. They had 3 children who lived, a daughter named Ruth, which was Hazel's idea and not Caleb's, and which told you everything about the woman she was, and 2 sons, and the daughter grew up to teach in the Larkspur School and taught every child in the valley alike, the Hartley children and the Pruitt children and Sapa's grandchildren in the same room at the same desks, which made a small scandal that lasted exactly 1 term and then became simply the way the school was run. The boy Ned, who had said the truest thing on that land when he was 8, took up the next section when his hard father passed and ranched alongside the oars all his life and named his own first son Caleb. The cabin grew to 4 rooms and then to 6. The granite marker on the hillside got a companion in time and then, in the fullness of years, a third, the 3 of them in a row above the meadow where the Silver Thread ran year-round and the valley spread out below toward the soft blue line of the far mountains. There was a thing Hazel did every spring, for as long as her hands would let her, which the children remembered longest. On the first warm evening of each year, the first night you could sit on the porch without a coat, she would carry a bucket of creek water out to the kitchen rows and water them by hand. The beans and the squash and the hardy turnips, the way she had that first summer, though by then there were grandchildren to do the hauling and a pump that would have made it easy. When one of them asked her once why she did it the hard way, she set the bucket down and looked out at the meadow a long moment and said that some things you do with your own 2 hands, so your hands remember, and that a marriage and a homestead and a hard country were all the same in that one respect, that they were not built by the people who waited at polite doors, but by the ones who knocked, and that she had knocked on the right door once in her life and everything good had come of it. She is buried up there now, beside the 2 who came before and after, under a granite marker cut by a grandson's hand. The firewood is still stacked by the cabin door every fall, by people who learned it from people who learned it from a man who could not say what he meant and a woman who would not be waved off. Up the Silver Thread, the water still runs, and on the first warm evening of every spring, someone still carries a bucket out to the rows by hand, so that the hands will remember. Did you ever knock on a door you were afraid would not open? Tell me about it, and stay a while, because there are other stories like this one, of guarded hearts and the people stubborn enough to wait outside them, and I have a great many left to tell.